The winter wind howled across the barren plains like a banshee, carrying with it the promise of death for those unprepared. Sarah McKenna pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped from her modest cabin into the bitter morning air. The snow had fallen heavy during the night, blanketing her struggling homestead in a pristine white that masked the harsh reality beneath. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. Sarah's breath formed small clouds as she made her way toward the well, her worn boots crunching through the snow with each determined step. At 32, she had already buried one husband and watched her dreams of prosperity die with him. Thomas had succumbed to the fever 3 summers past, leaving her with nothing but a failing homestead, a handful of chickens, and Thunder, her faithful sorrel gelding. Thunder represented more than just transportation in this unforgiving land. He was her lifeline, her connection to the distant trading post 20 miles away, her only means of escape should the worst come to pass. Without him, she would be trapped, isolated, and ultimately doomed when her meager supplies finally ran out. As she approached the well, something dark against the white snow caught her eye. Sarah's heart lurched as she realized it was a man, collapsed face down in the snow. His long black hair spread like spilled ink across the pristine surface. Even from a distance, she could see he was not moving. Her father's warnings echoed in her mind as she drew closer. Never trust an Apache, he had said. They are devils in human form, raiders and killers who show no mercy. But as Sarah knelt beside the fallen figure, she saw not a devil, but a man barely clinging to life. The warrior was perhaps 40 years of age, his weathered face bearing the proud lines of his people. An arrow protruded from his shoulder, the shaft broken but the iron point still buried deep in his flesh. Blood had frozen in dark patches on his buckskin shirt, and his skin had taken on the grayish pallor of approaching death. Sarah's hands trembled as she checked for signs of life. There, faint but steady, she felt the rhythm of his heart beneath her palm. He was alive but barely. The fever burned through him like wildfire, and without immediate help, he would surely perish before the day was through. She should leave him. Every practical instinct screamed at her to walk away, to let nature take its course. What business did she have saving an Apache warrior? Her own people would call her a fool or worse, a traitor. But as she looked down at his face, peaceful in unconsciousness, she saw not an enemy but a fellow human being in desperate need. Thunder nickered softly from the small corral beside the cabin, as if sensing her distress. Sarah's gaze moved between the dying man and her precious horse, understanding with crystal clarity what she had to do. A traveling medicine man had passed through just 2 days prior, heading north toward the reservation. He carried with him herbs and knowledge that could save this warrior's life, but he would demand payment. The only thing of value Sarah possessed was Thunder. Her heart breaking with each step, Sarah bridged the distance to her cabin and retrieved her husband's old blanket. She wrapped the unconscious Apache carefully, then somehow found the strength to drag him inside. The effort left her exhausted, but she managed to get him settled near the fireplace where the warmth might help fight the fever. The warrior's breathing was shallow and labored, each breath a struggle against the arrow wound and the infection that had taken hold. Sarah cleaned the wound as best she could with her limited supplies, then sat back on her heels, studying his face. Despite the circumstances, there was something noble about his features, a quiet dignity that persisted even in unconsciousness. She had heard stories of Apache warriors, tales of their fierce independence and their skill in battle. This man bore the scars of many conflicts, old wounds that spoke of a life lived on the edge of survival. Yet here he lay, as vulnerable as any other human being, dependent on the kindness of a stranger for his very life. As the morning wore on, Sarah made her decision. She saddled Thunder with trembling hands, her tears freezing on her cheeks as she pressed her face against his warm neck one final time. The horse had been her companion through the darkest days following Thomas's death, her one source of comfort in a world that had grown cold and unforgiving. The ride to catch up with the medicine man took her 3 precious hours, time during which the warrior might slip away entirely. But fortune smiled upon her, and she found the old healer making camp by a small stream, his pack animals grazing peacefully in the winter grass. The medicine man, a wizened Comanche named Two Eagles, listened to her story with growing amazement. That a white woman would sacrifice her only horse to save an Apache warrior was beyond his understanding. Yet he saw the truth in her desperate eyes. Thunder whinnied plaintively as Sarah transferred his reins to two eagles, the horse seeming to understand that their partnership was ending. In exchange, she received a leather pouch filled with healing herbs, detailed instructions for their use, and a promise that Thunder would be well cared for. The walk back to her homestead seemed endless, each step taking her further from her old life and deeper into an uncertain future. But with every mile, her resolve strengthened. She had made her choice, and she would see it through to the end. She found the warrior still breathing, though his fever had worsened in her absence. Sarah immediately set to work, brewing the medicinal tea exactly as two eagles had instructed. The bitter liquid had to be administered drop by drop, as the unconscious man could barely swallow. Through the long afternoon and into the evening, Sarah maintained her vigil. She bathed his burning skin with cool water, changed his bandages, and forced the healing brew between his parched lips. The work was exhausting, but she persevered, driven by a determination she had not felt since Thomas's death. As the sun set and darkness claimed the land, Sarah finally allowed herself a moment of rest. She had done everything possible, and now it was a matter of waiting. Either the warrior would survive the night, or her sacrifice would have been in vain. Sometime in the early hours before dawn, the fever finally broke. Sarah awakened from her restless sleep to find the warrior's eyes open, dark and alert, studying her with a mixture of confusion and wariness. She offered him water, which he accepted gratefully, then attempted to sit up despite his obvious weakness. The language barrier proved formidable, but gradually, through gestures and broken words, they began to communicate. His name, he indicated, was Arrow That Flies, and he was a warrior of the Chiricahua Apache. He had been wounded in a skirmish with soldiers 3 days prior and had been traveling north when exhaustion and blood loss finally claimed him. What amazed him most was not that she had saved his life, but that she had done so at such great personal cost. Through careful questioning and observation, he came to understand that she had traded her only horse for the medicine that now coursed through his veins. The magnitude of her sacrifice left him speechless. For 3 days, Arrow That Flies remained in Sarah's cabin, growing stronger with each passing hour. They spoke little, but a deep understanding developed between them. She learned that he had lost his own family to the ongoing conflicts between his people and the white settlers, that he carried the same grief and loneliness that had haunted her since Thomas's death. He, in turn, saw her genuine compassion, her willingness to risk everything for a stranger. In his culture, such selflessness was highly honored, a virtue that transcended tribal boundaries. Here was a woman who embodied the very best of humanity, regardless of the color of her skin. On the 4th morning, Arrow That Flies announced his intention to leave. His strength had returned sufficiently for travel, and he knew that his continued presence put Sarah at risk. If other whites discovered she had harbored an Apache warrior, the consequences could be severe. As he prepared to depart, Sarah made no effort to detain him. She understood the dangers as well as he did, and she had no desire to see him recaptured or killed. She packed what little food she could spare and watched silently as he made ready to leave. At the door of her cabin, Arrow That Flies turned back to look at her one final time. In his dark eyes, she saw a depth of gratitude that needed no words to express. He placed his hand over his heart, then extended it toward her, a gesture of respect and eternal friendship. Then he was gone, disappearing into the winter landscape like a ghost. Sarah stood in her doorway for a long time, watching the empty horizon and wondering if she would ever see him again. The silence of her homestead seemed more profound than ever, broken only by the clucking of her chickens and the whisper of wind through the bare branches of the cottonwood trees. Days passed in a blur of routine survival. Without Thunder, Sarah's world had shrunk to the boundaries of her property. She could no longer make the journey to the trading post, could no longer consider fleeing if circumstances became desperate. She was truly alone now, committed to whatever fate the harsh frontier might bring. On the 7th morning after Arrow That Flies' departure, Sarah was awakened by a sound that sent her heart racing. The thunder of hooves approached her homestead, growing louder with each passing second. Fear gripped her as she peered through her window, expecting to see soldiers or hostile raiders bearing down upon her cabin. Instead, she saw something that took her breath away. Arrow That Flies sat astride a magnificent paint stallion, but he was not alone. Behind him came a herd of wild Mustangs, perhaps 20 in all, their coats gleaming in the morning sunlight. The warrior had returned, and he had brought with him a gift beyond her wildest dreams. Sarah stepped outside, her hand pressed to her heart, as Arrow That Flies dismounted and approached her. The Mustangs milled about nervously, their wild eyes reflecting both fear and curiosity. These were not broken horses, but creatures of the plains, proud and free. Through gestures and the few English words he had learned, Arrow That Flies explained his gift. She had given him her one horse to save his life, and now he returned her generosity 20-fold. These Mustangs were hers, to keep or to sell as she chose. With such wealth, she could rebuild her life, perhaps even find the prosperity that had eluded her for so long. The warrior's eyes held no expectation of further reward or gratitude. He had simply honored a debt that his conscience would not allow to remain unpaid. In his culture, such acts of reciprocal kindness were sacred, binding the giver and receiver in bonds stronger than blood. Sarah wept openly as she watched the Mustangs, understanding that her life had just changed forever. The sale of even half the herd would provide her with enough money to last several years, to make the improvements her homestead desperately needed, to secure her future in ways she had never dared hope. But more than the material wealth, Arrow That Flies had given her something far more precious. He had shown her that kindness, once given freely, returns in ways impossible to predict or measure. Her act of compassion had not only saved his life, but had opened a door to a friendship that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. As the sun climbed higher, Arrow That Flies prepared to leave once more. This time, however, his departure felt different. He was not fleeing into exile but returning to his people with the knowledge that not all whites were enemies, that some possessed hearts capable of true generosity. Sarah stood among her new herd, watching until the warrior disappeared over the horizon. The Mustangs had begun to settle, their initial nervousness giving way to curiosity about their new surroundings. She knew it would take time to gentle them, to transform them from wild creatures into reliable companions, but she also knew she had that time now. The widow who had given her one horse to save a dying Apache had received in return not just a herd of Mustangs, but a renewed faith in the fundamental goodness that connects all people. In a land often divided by fear and prejudice, she had discovered that compassion knows no boundaries, and that the smallest acts of kindness can echo across the vast expanse of the human heart. Thanks for joining us on this journey across the frontier. If the story moved you, let us know in the comments what act of kindness changed your life. Your stories inspire us to keep sharing these tales of hope and human connection.